Hello again, everyone. Glad to be back, bringing you another reading for the Mark Fisher reading group, where we will be going through the intended material for the Post-Capitalist Desire module. Today, I am going to be doing the Srniceck and Williams reading from their book, Inventing the Future, Postcapitalism, and a World Without Work. We have two sections, Postwork, Imaginaries, and Conclusion. And we will jump into it without further ado. Chapter 6, Postwork Imaginaries. Quote, "The goal of the future is full unemployment." Arthur C. Clarke. Whereas the previous chapter analyzed the changing social conditions that are making a post-work world increasingly necessary, this chapter will outline what a post-work world might mean in practice. To that end, we advance some broad demands to start building a platform for a post-work society. In asserting the centrality of demands, we are breaking with a widespread tendency of today's radical left that believes making no demands is the height of radicalism. These critics often claim that making a demand means giving in to the existing order of things by asking, and therefore legitimating, an authority. But these accounts miss the antagonism at the heart of making demands, and the ways in which they are essential for constituting an active agent of change. In this light, the rejection of demands is a symptom of theoretical confusion, not practical progress. A politics without demands is simply a collection of aimless bodies. Any meaningful vision of the future will set out proposals and goals, and this chapter is a contribution to that potential discussion. None of the proposals presented will be radically new, but this is part of their strength. It is not a free-floating project, since frameworks and movements already exist and have traction in the world. Today, revolutionary demands appear naive, while reformist demands appear futile. Too often, that is where the debate ends, with each side denouncing the other and the strategic imperative to change our conditions forgotten. The demands we propose are therefore intended as non-reformist reforms. By this we mean three things. First, they have a utopian edge that strains at the limits of what capitalism can concede. This transforms them from polite requests into insistent demands, charged with belligerence and antagonism. Such demands combine the futural orientation of utopias with the immediate intervention of the demand, invoking a, quote, utopianism without apology, unquote. Second, these non-reformist proposals are grounded in real tendencies of the world today, giving them a viability that revolutionary dreams lack. Third, and most importantly, such demands shift the current political equilibrium and construct a platform for further development. They project an open-ended escape from the present, rather than a mechanical transition into the next predetermined stage of history. The proposals in this chapter will not break us out of capitalism, but they do promise to break us out of neoliberalism and to establish a new equilibrium of political, economic, and social forces. From the social democratic consensus to the neoliberal consensus, our argument is that the left should mobilize around a post-work consensus. With a post-work society, we would have even more potential to launch forward to greater goals. But this is a project that must be carried out over the long term, decades rather than years, cultural shifts rather than electoral cycles. Given the reality of the weakened left today, there is only one way forward: to patiently rebuild its power, a topic that will be covered in the chapters to follow. There simply is no other way to bring about a post-work world. We must therefore attend to these longer-term strategic goals and rebuild the collective agencies that might eventually bring them about. By directing the left towards a post-work future, not only will significant gains be aimed for, but political power will be built in the process. In the end, we believe a post-work society is not only achievable, given the material conditions, but also viable and desirable. This chapter charts a way forward, building a post-work society on the basis of fully automating the economy, reducing the workweek, implementing a universal basic income, and achieving a cultural shift in the understanding of work. Full automation. Our first demand is for a fully automated economy. Using the latest technological developments, such an economy would aim to liberate humanity from the drudgery of work while simultaneously producing increasing amounts of wealth. Without full automation, post-capitalist futures must necessarily choose between abundance at the expense of freedom, echoing the work centricity of Soviet Russia, or freedom at the expense of abundance, represented by primitivist dystopias. With automation, by contrast, machines can increasingly produce all necessary goods and services, while also releasing humanity from the effort of producing them. For this reason, we argue that the tendencies towards automation and the replacement of human labor should be enthusiastically accelerated and targeted as a political project of the left. This is a project that takes an existing capitalist tendency and seeks to push it beyond the acceptable parameters of capitalist social relations. Capitalism has long been synonymous with rapid changes in technology, driven by the imperative to accumulate. The means of production are continually transformed. In the 19th century, agriculture began to be mechanized, and small plots of land became increasingly centralized under larger and larger industrial farms. Craftwork was farmed too, with machinery appearing as an alien intervention into the production process. Work that had traditionally been undertaken by a skilled laborer was now broken down into its DeSkilled constituent tasks, and often carried out using machinery. Workers became assigned to partial tasks, and tools that had once been governed by workers became machines that rhythmically conducted the laborers. Work became increasingly repetitive, de-skilled, and ruled by machinery, with greater demand for cheap, unskilled laborers, particularly women and children. In the early 20th century, this tendency began to shift with the introduction of technologies that eliminated the most routine and mundane of manual tasks, such as hauling and conveying goods. Skilled workers became increasingly necessary in overseeing the new machines, carrying out expanding service work, and managing the increasingly large firms that were emerging. The need for skilled labor was further amplified in the early 20th century by the rise of office technologies, typewriters, photocopiers, and so on, that required relatively well-educated operators. In other words, technology is not uniformly de-skilling, and the increased demand for skilled labor over the past century testifies to that. Over this period, manufacturing employment continued to decline due to its susceptibility to productivity-enhancing technology. The automation of mass production manufacturing in the early 20th century was eventually extended with the automation of small batch manufacturing. While the industrial sector employed 1,000 robots in 1970, today it uses over 1.6 million robots. In terms of employment, manufacturing has reached a global saturation point. Even in developing countries, the trend is towards deindustrialization, with employment growth now confined predominantly to the service sector. Concurrent with the decline of manufacturing, the latter half of the 20th century oversaw another shift. While earlier office technologies had supplemented workers and increased demand for them, the development of the microprocessor and computing technologies began to replace semi-skilled workers in many areas. For example, telephone operators and secretaries. The roboticization of services is now gathering steam, with now over 150,000 professional service robots sold in the past 15 years. Under particular threat have been, quote, routine jobs that can be codified into a series of steps. These are tasks that computers are perfectly suited to accomplish once a programmer has created the appropriate software, leading to a drastic reduction in the numbers of routine manual and cognitive jobs over the past 4 decades. The result has been a polarization of the labor market, since many middle-wage, mid-skilled jobs are routine and therefore subject to automation. Across both North America and Western Europe, the labor market is now characterized by a predominance of workers in the low-skilled, low-wage manual and service jobs, for example, fast food, retail, transport, hospitality, and warehouse workers, along with a smaller number of workers in high-skilled, high-wage, non-routine cognitive jobs. The most recent wave of automation is poised to change this distribution of the labor market drastically, as it comes to encompass every aspect of the economy: data collection, radio frequency, identification, big data, new kinds of production, the flexible production of robots, additive manufacturing, automated fast food, services, AI, customer assistance, care for the elderly, decision-making, computational models, software agents, financial allocation, algorithmic trading, and especially distribution, the logistics revolution, self-driving cars, drone container ships, and automated warehouses. In every single function of the economy, from production to distribution to management to retail, we see large-scale tendencies towards automation. This latest wave of automation is predicted upon algorithmic enhancements, particularly in machine learning and deep learning. Rapid developments in robotics and exponential growth in computing power, the source of big data, are coalescing into a second machine age, that is, transforming the range of tasks that machines can fulfill. It is creating an era that is historically unique in a number of ways. New pattern recognition technologies are rendering both routine and non-routine tasks subject to automation. Complex communication technologies are making computers better than humans at certain skilled knowledge tasks, and advances in robotics are rapidly making technology better at a wide variety of manual labor tasks. For instance, self-driving cars can involve the automation of non-routine manual tasks, and non-routine cognitive tasks, such as writing news stories and researching legal precedents, are now being accomplished by robots. The scope of these developments means that everyone from stock analysts to construction workers to chefs to journalists is vulnerable to being replaced by machines. Workers who move symbols on a screen are as at risk as those moving goods around a warehouse. One report forecasts a, quote, depopulation of trading floors, unquote, as robots continue to infiltrating the financial world. Retail jobs, long a bastion of post-industrial employment, are set to be taken over by machines, and over 140 million cognitive jobs worldwide are forecasted to be eliminated. While the last wave of automation led to a polarization of the labor market, this newest wave looks set to decimate the low-skilled, low-wage end of the labor market. And as robots substitute for human labor, workers are likely to face lower wages and increasing immiseration. At the very least, then, the emerging wave of automation will drastically change the composition of the labor market and potentially lead to a significant reduction in demand for workers. A number of economists have pointed out, however, that productivity has not increased to the degree that would be expected by a revolution in automation. If a machine is replacing half of the workers in a factory, productivity should double if the factory produces the same number of goods. In fact, however, there has been a broad global slowdown in productivity growth over the past decade, particularly following the crisis. Leaving aside the fact that productivity is a notoriously difficult thing to measure, we believe a few phenomena can help explain this anomaly. First, it is highly likely that low wages are repressing investment in productivity-enhancing technologies. Access to a large reserve of cheap labor means that companies have less incentive to focus on capital investment. Why purchase new machines when cheaper workers will do the same for less? This means that in effort to bring about full automation, fighting for higher global wages is a crucial complementary task. Second, there is likely a delay factor at work. In the 1990s, the IT revolution took some time to become expressed in productivity figures, as companies had to invest and then adapt to the new capacities of these technologies. Organizations have to be changed, new skills have to be learned, and processes have to be reworked in order to make effective use of these new technologies. In general, it appears that investments in digital technologies face productivity lags of 5 to 15 years. Today, many of the technologies under discussion are incredibly new and were unimaginable even a decade ago. This novelty means that we should expect a delay in the response of productivity figures as the technologies are adopted and then adapted into the way businesses run. Finally, and most importantly, our argument here relies largely on a normative claim rather than a descriptive one. Full automation is something that can and should be achieved, regardless of whether it is yet being carried out. For instance, out of the U.S. companies that could benefit from incorporating industrial robots, less than 10% have done so. This is but one area for full automation to take hold in, and this reiterates the importance of making full automation a political demand, rather than assuming it will come about from an economic necessity. A variety of policies can help in this project. More state investment, higher minimum wages, and research devoted to technologies that replace rather than augment workers. In the most detailed estimates of the labor market, it is suggested that between 47 and 80% of today's jobs are capable of being automated. Let us take this estimate not as a deterministic prediction, but instead as the outer limit of a political project against work. We should take these numbers as a standard against which to measure our success. While full automation of the economy is presented here as an ideal and a demand, in practice, it is unlikely to be fully achieved. In certain spheres, human labor is likely to continue for technical, economic, and ethical reasons. On a technical level, machines today remain worse than humans at jobs involving creative work, highly flexible work, effective work, and most tasks relying on tacit rather than explicit knowledge. The engineering problems involved in automating these tasks appear insurmountable for the next 2 decades, though similar claims were made about self-driving cars 10 years ago. And a program of full automation would aim to invest research money into overcoming these limits. A second barrier to full automation occurs for economic reasons. Certain tasks can already be completed by machines, but the cost of the machines exceeds the cost of the equivalent labor. Despite the efficiency, accuracy, and productivity of machine labor, capitalism prefers to make profits and therefore uses human labor whenever it is cheaper than capital investment. A program of full automation would aim to overcome this as well, through measures as simple as raising the minimum wage, supporting labor development movements, and using state subsidies to incentivize and replace human labor. A final limit of full automation is the moral status we give to certain jobs, such as care work. These tasks, including the raising of children, are ones that many would argue must be carried out by human beings. We can outline 2 broad approaches to these sorts of labors. A first approach would agree that such labor has moral value and should be carried out by humans rather than machines. In a post-work society, however, care labor could be given greater value, turning society away from the privileged status bestowed upon profitable labor. The free time that accrues from full automation could also facilitate experimentation with alternative domestic arrangements. There is a long history of utopian experiments that can be drawn upon to rethink how our societies organize domestic, reproductive, and care labor. All of this, it must be stressed, would still require a political movement to achieve. A post-work world must facilitate change, but it cannot guarantee it. A more radical approach, however, argues that automating much of this labor should be a goal for the future. Indeed, the stereotype that women are naturally nurturing and desiring of this affective labor is often a pernicious cover for their continued exploitation. But what if much of this labor could be eliminated? Traditionally, the household has been a space that featured little technological change. Its unpaid nature and lack of productivity norms have given capitalism few incentives to invest in the reduction of household labor. Yet, increasingly, domestic tasks like cleaning and house and folding clothes, for example, can be delegated to machines. Assistive technologies and effective computing are also making inroads in automating some of the highly personal and embarrassing care work that might be better suited for impersonal robots. More speculatively, some have argued that the pain and suffering involved in pregnancy is something that should be relegated to the past, rather than mystified as natural and beautiful. In this vision, synthetic forms of biological reproduction would enable a newfound equality between the sexes. We will not adjudicate on these paths here, but simply set them out as options opened up by a post-work world. Whatever approach is taken, though, the point is that labor will not be immediately or entirely eliminated, but instead be progressively reduced. Full automation is a utopian demand that aims to reduce necessary labor as much as possible. It's not Mondays you hate, it's your job. A second major demand for building a post-work platform involves a return to classic ideas about reducing the length of the working week with no cut in pay. From the beginning of capitalism, workers have struggled against the imposition of fixed working hours, and the demand for shorter hours was a key component of the early labor movement. Initial battles saw high levels of resistance in the form of individual absenteeism, numerous holidays, and irregular work habits. This resistance to normal working hours continues today in widespread slacking off with workers often surfing the internet rather than doing their job. At every step of the way, then, workers have struggled to escape normal working hours, and many of the labor movement's earliest successes had to do with reducing work time. The 2-day weekend, for example, emerged spontaneously from workers' predilection for drinking and spending an extra night recovering rather than working. The weekend's eventual consolidation as a recognized and bounded period of time off was the product of sustained political struggles, a process that was not completed in the Western world until the 1970s. Likewise, workers achieved significant success in reducing the working week from 60 hours in 1900 to just below 35 hours during the Great Depression. Such was the speed of success that, over a period of 5 years in the 1930s, the working week declined by 18 hours. During the earlier years of the Depression, the idea of a shorter working week enjoyed bipartisan support in the United States and legislation for a 30-hour working week, which was thought to be imminent. Simultaneously, intellectuals prophesied even further reductions in work time, imagining worlds where work was reduced to a bare minimum. In a classic statement, Paul Lafargue, hope I pronounced that correct, Paul Lafargue, Lafargue, argued for limiting work to just 3 hours a day. Keynes famously argued for the same outcome, calculating that by 2030, we would all be working 15-hour working weeks, though it is less well known that he was simply verbalizing what were the broadly held beliefs of the time. And Marx made the shortening of the working week central to his entire post-capitalist vision, arguing that it represented a basic prerequisite to reaching the realm of freedom. But such visions of a 3-hour workday have disappeared. The near-century-long push for shorter working hours ended abruptly during the Great Depression, when business opinion and government policy decided to use make-work programs in response to unemployment. Soon after World War II, the working week stabilized at 40 hours across much of the Western world, and there has been little serious consideration of changing this. Instead, there has been a general expansion of working in the ensuing decades. First, there has been an increase in time spent at jobs throughout society. As women have entered the workforce, the working week remained the same, and the overall amount of time devoted to jobs therefore increased. Secondly, there has been a progressive elimination of the work-life distinction, with work coming to permeate every aspect of our waking lives. Many of us are now tied to work at all times, with emails, phone calls, texts, and job anxieties impinging upon us constantly. Salaried workers are often compelled to work unrecognized overtime, while many workers feel the social pressure to be seen working long hours. These demands mean that the average full-time U.S. worker in fact logs closer to 47 hours a week. On top of this, a vast amount of work is unpaid and therefore uncounted in official data. There is also an ongoing gender divide within this unpaid labor force. While waged work remains difficult for many to find, unpaid work is proliferating. An entire sphere of shadow work is emerging with automation at the point of sale. With work being delegated to users, think self-checkouts and ATMs. Moreover, there is the hidden labor required to retain a job, financial management, job searching if unemployed, constant skills training, commuting time, and the all-important gendered sphere of the labor involved in caring for children, family members, and other dependents. If work has extended itself into so many areas of our lives, a return to a shorter working week would bring with it a number of benefits. Beyond the most obvious that it increases free time, it would bring with it a series of more subtle benefits. In the first place, reducing the working week constitutes a key response to rising automation. In fact, the role of this policy in previous periods of automation is often forgotten. Many commentators have rightly pointed to the history of technological change to show that it needed not lead to mass unemployment. However, the primary periods of automation coincided with significant reductions in the working week. Employment was often sustained by redistributing the work. A second benefit of this policy is its various environmental advantages. For instance, reductions in the working week would lead to significant reductions in energy consumption and our overall carbon footprint. Increased free time would also mean a reduction in all the convenience goods bought to fit into our hectic work schedules. More broadly, using productivity improvements for less work rather than more output would mean that energy efficiency improvements would go towards reducing environmental impacts. A reduction in working hours is therefore an essential plank in any response to climate change. Other research suggests that a shorter working week would bring a general reduction in the stress, anxiety, and mental health problems fostered by neoliberalism. But one of the most important reasons for reducing work time is that it is a demand that both consolidates and generates class power. In the first place, reducing work time can be deployed as a temporary tactic in political struggle. Working a contract, strikes, and other ways of removing labor time are means to exert pressure on capitalists. But secondly, and most importantly, the reduction of the working week also makes the labor movement stronger. By withdrawing labor hours from the market, the total supply of labor goes down and worker power increases. As two commentators recently noted, quote, "No other bargaining demand simultaneously enhances bargaining position. Furthermore, no other strategic logic initiates a continuous virtuous cycle in which each victory establishes the conditions for strength in the next struggle." For these reasons, the goal of reducing the working week should be an immediate and prominent demand of the 21st century left. Our preference is for the establishment of a 3-day weekend, rather than a reduction in the working day. In order to cut down on commuting and to build upon the long holiday weekends already in existence, this demand can be achieved in a number of ways. Through trade union struggles, pressure from social movements, and legislative change by political parties. Trade unions, building a strategy for the future rather than accepting the capitalist demand for jobs at all costs, could use collective bargaining to accept automation in return for a shorter working week. Indeed, the historical record suggests that trade unions are often reactive in the face of technological change, and that wage concessions only delay automation rather than preventing it. An alternative approach that focused on the reduction and diffusion of work could reduce work without leaving workers out on the streets. Efforts can be made to gain recognition for unofficial, unpaid labor as part of the working week, reducing it simply by bringing attention to it. A focus on a shorter working week also requires that unions build links with part-time and precarious workers. But while unions are necessary in this struggle, they are not sufficient, for the simple reason that each sector has different potentials for automation and productivity increases. A broader struggle is necessary if there is to be a break with the current logic of neoliberalism. Social movements and ideological institutions must contribute to this struggle by shaping the space of possibility. A number of think tanks, including the New Economics Foundation and the Jimmy Reed Foundation, have started to call openly for a reduction of the working week. Groups in the UK, such as the Precarious Workers Brigade and Plan C, are highlighting unpaid work and mobilizing around issues concerning the status of work in society today. But most significantly, there is already a high level of public desire for the reduction of the working week, with public opinion polls showing a majority of the population supporting the idea. There are also a variety of policy approaches to shorten the working week. Interventions can alter labor costs from a per-person basis to a per-hour basis, making it less cost-effective for business to enforce long hours. Countries like Belgium and the Netherlands have given workers the right to demand reduced hours without being discriminated against employers. The Netherlands has also begun to shorten this working week at each end of the age spectrum. The young and the old are now transitioned into an out of the workforce, respectively, through gradual changes in their work hours. All of these options can and should be mobilized in pursuit of a project to reduce the working week. The wage don't fit. These first two proposals equate to the reduction of labor demand through full automation and the reduction of labor supply through the shortening of the working week. The combined outcome of these measures would be the liberation of a significant amount of free time without a reduction in the economic output or a significant increase in unemployment. Yet, this free time will be of little value if people can continue struggling to make ends meet. As Paul Maddock puts it, quote, "The leisure of starving or the needy is no leisure at all, but a relentless activity aimed at staying alive or improving their situation," unquote. The underemployed, for instance, have plenty of free time, but the lack of means to enjoy it. Underemployed, it turns out, is really just a euphemism for underwaged. This is why an essential demand in a post-work society is for a universal basic income, or UBI, giving every citizen a livable amount of money without any means testing. It is an idea that has periodically popped up throughout history. In the early 1940s, a version of it was advanced as an alternative to the Beveridge Report that eventually shaped the UK welfare state. In a now largely forgotten period during the 1960s and 1970s, the basic income was central to proposals for U.S. welfare reform. Economists, NGOs, and policymakers explored the idea in detail, and a number of small-scale experiments were set up in Canada and the United States. Such was the influence of UBI that over 1,300 economists signed a petition pushing the U.S. Congress to enact a, quote, national system of income guarantees, unquote. The three separate administrations gave serious consideration to the proposal, and two presidents, Nixon and Carter, attempted to pass legislation to achieve it. In other words, UBI very nearly became a reality in the 1970s, while Alaska eventually implemented a basic income funded by its oil wealth. The idea largely disappeared from debate in the wake of neoliberal hegemony. But recent years have seen the idea undergo a resurgence in popularity. In both mainstream and critical media, it has gained traction, being taken up by Paul Krugman, Martin Wolf, and the New York Times, the Financial Times, and The Economist. The Swiss are holding a referendum on UBI in 2016, and the proposal has been recommended by parliamentary committees in other countries. Various political parties have adopted it in their manifestos, and there have been new experiments with it in Namibia and India. The idea has a global scope, having been promoted forcefully by groups in Brazil, South Africa, Italy, and Germany, and by an international network involving over 20 countries. The movement for a UBI is thus once again resurgent in the wake of the 2008 crisis and the austerity regimes put in place after it. The demand for UBI, however, is subject to competing hegemonic forces. It is just as open to being mobilized for a libertarian dystopia as for a post-work society, an ambiguity that has led many to mistakenly conflate the two poles. In demanding a UBI, therefore, three key factors must be articulated in order to make it meaningful. It must provide a sufficient amount of income to live on, it must be universal, provided to everyone unconditionally, and it must be a supplement to the welfare state rather than a replacement of it. The first point is obvious enough. A UBI must provide a materially adequate income. The exact amount will vary between countries and regions, but it can be relatively easily arrived at with the already existing data. The risk is that, if set too low, UBI becomes just a government subsidy to businesses. In addition, UBI must be universal and given to everyone unconditionally, and there would be no means testing or other measures required to receive the UBI. It would break free of the disciplinary nature of welfare capitalism. Moreover, a universal grant avoids the stigmatization of welfare, since everyone receives it. As we argued in Chapter 4, the invocation of universalism also obliges the continual subversion of any restricted application of a basic income in terms of individual status as citizens, immigrants, or prisoners. The demand for universality provides the basis for a continued struggle to expand the scope and scale of the basic income. Lastly, the UBI must be supplement to the welfare state. The conservative argument for a basic income, which must be avoided at all costs, is that it should simply replace the welfare state by providing a lump sum of money to every individual. In this scenario, the UBI would just become a vector of increased marketization, transforming social services into private markets. Rather than being some aberration of neoliberalism, it would simply extend its essential gesture by creating new markets. By contrast, the demand here is for UBI as a supplement to a received welfare state. Drawing upon moral arguments and empirical research, there are a vast number of reasons to support a UBI. Reduced poverty, better public health, and reduced health costs, fewer high school dropouts, reductions in petty crime, more time with family and friends, and less state bureaucracy. Depending on how UBI is presented, it is capable of generating support from all across the political spectrum, from libertarians, conservatives, anarchists, Marxists, feminists, and others. The potency of the demand lies partly in this ambiguity, making it capable of mobilizing broad popular support. However, for our purposes, the significance of UBI as a demand lies in four key interrelated factors. The first point is to emphasize that the demand for UBI is a demand for political transformation, not just an economic one. It is often thought that UBI is simply a form of redistribution from the rich to the poor, or that it is just a measure to maintain economic growth by stimulating consumer demand. From this perspective, UBI would have impeccable reformist credentials and be little more than a glorified progressive tax system. Yet the real significance of UBI lies in the way it overturns the asymmetry of power that currently exists between labor and capital. As we saw in the discussion of surplus populations, the proletariat is defined by its separation from the means of production and subsistence. The proletariat is thereby forced to sell itself in the job market in order to gain the income necessary to survive. The most fortunate among us have the leisure to choose which job to take, but few of us have the capacity to choose no job. A basic income changes this condition by giving the proletariat a means of subsistence without dependency on a job. Workers, in other words, have the option to choose whether to take a job or not, in many ways taking neoclassical economics at its word and making work truly voluntary. A UBI, therefore, unbinds the coercive aspects of wage labor, partially decommodifies labor, and thus transforms the political relationship between labor and capital. Transformation, making work voluntary rather than coerced, has a number of significant consequences. In the first place, it increases class power by reducing slack in the labor market. Surplus populations show what happens when there are large amounts of slack in the labor market. Wages fall, and employers are free to debase workers. By contrast, when the labor market is tight, labor gains the political edge. The economist Michel Kalecki recognized this long ago when he argued that it explained why full employment must be resisted at every step. If every worker were employed, the threat of being fired would lose its disciplinary character. There would be more than enough jobs waiting just outside. Workers would gain the upper hand, and capital would lose its political power. The same dynamic holds for a basic income. By eliminating the reliance on wage labor, workers gain control over how much labor to supply, giving them significant power in the labor market. Class power is also increased in a variety of other ways. Strikes are easier to mobilize, since workers no longer have to worry or dwindling strike funds. The amount of time spent working for a wage can be modified to one's own desire, with free time spent building communities and engaging with politics. One can slow down and reflect, safely protected from the contrast or the constant pressures of neoliberalism. The anxieties that surround work and unemployment are reduced with the safety net of a UBI. Moreover, the demand for UBI combines the needs of the employed, the unemployed, the underemployed, migrant labor, temporary workers, students, and the disabled. It articulates a common interest between these groups and provides a populist orientation for them to mobilize towards. The second related feature of UBI is that it transforms precarity and unemployment from a state of insecurity to a state of voluntary flexibility. It is often forgotten that the initial push for flexible labor came from workers as a way of demolishing the constraining permanency of traditional Fordist labor. The repetitiveness of a 9-to-5 job, combined with the tediousness of most work, is hardly an appealing prospect for a lifelong career. the demands of care labor often require a flexible approach as well, further undermining the appeal of traditional jobs. Marx himself invokes the liberating aspects of flexible labor in his famous claim that communism, quote, makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic, unquote. In the face of these desires for flexibility, capital adapted and co-opted them into a new form of exploitation. Today, flexible labor simply presents itself as precarity and insecurity rather than freedom. The UBI responds to this generalization of precarity and transforms it from a state to be feared back into a state of liberation. Third, a basic income would necessitate a rethinking of the values attributed to different types of work. Given that workers would no longer be forced to take a job, they would simply reject jobs that paid too little, required too much work, offered too few benefits, or were demeaning and undignified. Low-waged labor and work is often crass and disempowering, and under a program of UBI, it is unlikely that many would want to undertake it. The result would be that hazardous, boring, and unattractive work would have to be better paid, while more rewarding, invigorating, and attractive work would be less well paid. In other words, the nature of work would become a measure of its value, not merely its profitability. The outcome of this revaluation would also mean that as wages for the worst jobs rose, there would be new incentives to automate them. UBI, therefore, forms a positive feedback loop with the demand for full automation. On the other hand, a basic income would not only transform the value of the worst jobs, but also go some way towards recognizing the unpaid labor of most care work. In the same way that the demand for wages for housework recognized and politicized the domestic labor of women, so too does UBI recognize and politicize the generalized way in which we are all responsible for reproducing society, from informal to formal work, from domestic to public work, from individual to collective work. What is central is not productive labor, defined in either traditional Marxist or neoclassical terms, but rather the more general category of reproductive labor. Given that we all contribute to the reproduction and production of capitalism, our activity deserves to be remunerated as well. In recognizing this, the UBI indicates a shift from remuneration based upon ability to remuneration based upon basic need. All the genetic, historical, and social variations that make effort a poor measure of a person's worth are rejected here, and instead people are valued simply for being people. Finally, a basic income is a fundamentally feminist proposal. Its disregard for the gender division of labor overcomes some of the biases of the traditional welfare state predicated upon a male breadwinner. Equally, it recognizes the contributions of unwaged domestic laborers to the reproduction of society and provides them with an income accordingly. The financial independence that comes with a basic income is also crucial to developing the synthetic freedom of women. It enables experimentation with different forms of family and community structure that are no longer bound to the model of the privatized nuclear family, and financial independence can reconfigure intimate relationships as well. One of the more unexpected findings of the experiments with UBI has been that the divorce rate tended to rise. Conservative commentators jumped on this as proof of the demand's immorality. But higher divorce rates are easily explained as women gaining the financial means to leave dysfunctional relationships. A basic income can therefore enable easier experimentation with the family structure, more possibilities for the provision of childcare, and an easier transformation of the gendered division of labor. Moreover, unlike the demand for, quote, wages for housework, unquote, in the late 1970s, the demand for UBI promises to break out of the wage relation rather than reinforce it. While a universal basic income may appear economically reformist, its political implications are therefore significant. It transforms precarity, it recognizes social labor, it makes class power easier to mobilize, and it extends the space in which to experiment with how we organize communities and families. It is a redistribution mechanism that transforms production relations. It is an economic mechanism that changes the politics of work. And in terms of class struggle, there is little to distinguish full employment from full unemployment. Both tighten the labor market, give power to labor, and make it much more difficult to exploit workers. Full unemployment has the added advantages of not being reliant upon the gendered division of labor between the household and formal economy, of not keeping workers chained to wage relation, and of allowing workers autonomy over their lives. For all of these reasons, the classic social democratic demand for full unemployment should be replaced with the future-oriented demand for full unemployment. The right to be lazy. What are the impediments of implementing a basic income? While the problem of funding UBI appears immense, most research in fact suggests that it would be relatively easy to finance through some combination of reducing duplicate programs, raising taxes on the rich, inheritance taxes, consumption taxes, carbon taxes, cutting spending on the military, cutting industry and agriculture subsidies, and cracking down on tax evasion. The most difficult hurdles for UBI and for a post-work society are not economic, but political and cultural. Political because the forces that will mobilize against it are immense, and cultural because work is so deeply ingrained into our very identity. We will examine the political obstacles in the next two chapters, but turn to the cultural ones here. One of the most difficult problems in implementing a UBI and building a post-work society will be overcoming the pervasive pressure to submit to the work ethic. Indeed, the failure of the United States' earlier attempt to implement a basic income was primarily because it challenged and accepted notions about the work ethic of the poor and underemployed. Rather than seeing unemployment as the result of a deficient individual work ethic, the UBI has proposal recognized it as a structural program. Yet the language that framed the proposal maintained strict divisions between those who were working and those who were on welfare. Despite the plan effacing such a distinction, the working poor ended up rejecting the plan out of a fear that being stigmatized as a welfare recipient. Racial biases reinforced this resistance, since welfare has been seen as a black issue, and whites were loath to be associated with it. And the lack of a class identification between the working poor and unemployed, the surplus population, meant that there was no social basis for a meaningful movement in favor of a basic income. Overcoming the work ethic will be equally central to any future attempts at building a post-work world. As we saw in Chapter 3, neoliberalism has established a set of incentives that compel us to act and identify ourselves as competitive subjects. Orbiting around this subject is a constellation of images related to self-reliance and independence that necessarily conflict with the program of a post-work society. Our lives have become increasingly structured around competitive realization, and work has become the primary avenue for achieving this. Work, no matter how degrading or low-paid or inconvenient, is deemed an ultimate good. This is the mantra of both mainstream political parties and most trade unions, associated with rhetoric about getting people back into work, the importance of working families and cutting welfare so that it, quote, always pays to work, unquote. This is matched by a parallel cultural effort demonizing those without jobs. Newspapers blare headlines about the worthlessness of welfare recipients, TV shows sensationalize and mock the poor, and the ever-looming figure of the welfare cheat is continually evoked. Work has become central to our very self-conception, so much so that when presented with the idea of doing less work, many people ask, quote, but what would I do, unquote? The fact that so many people find it impossible to imagine a meaningful life outside of work demonstrates the extent to which the work ethic has infected our minds. While typically associated with the Protestant work ethic, the submission to work is in fact implicit in many religions. These ethics demand dedication to one's work regardless of the nature of the job, instilling a moral imperative that drudgery should be valued. While originating in religious ideas about ensuring a better afterlife, the goal of the work ethic has eventually replaced with a secular devotion to improvement in this life. This imperative have taken on a liberal humanist character, portraying work as the central means of self-expression. Work has come to be driven into our identity, portrayed as the only means for true self-fulfillment. In a job interview, for instance, everyone knows the worst answer to "why do you want this job" is to say money, even as it remains the repressed truth. Contemporary service work heightens this phenomenon in the absence of clear metrics for productivity. Workers instead put on performances of productivity, pretending to enjoy their job or smiling while being yelled at by a customer. Working long hours has become a sign of devotion to the job, even as it perpetuates the gender pay gap. With work tied so tightly into our identities, overcoming the work ethic will require overcoming ourselves. The central ideological support for this work ethic is that remuneration be tied to suffering. Everywhere one looks, there is a drive to make people suffer before they can receive a reward. Epithets thrown at homeless beggars, the demonization of those on the dole, the labyrinthine system of bureaucracy set up to receive benefits, the unpaid, quote, job experience, unquote, imposed upon the unemployed, the sadistic penalization of those who are seen as getting something for free, all reveal the truth that our society's remuneration requires work and suffering. Whether for a religious or a secular goal, suffering is thought to constitute a necessary rite of passage. People must endure through work before they can receive wages. They must prove their worthiness before the eyes of capital. This thinking has an obvious theological basis, where suffering is thought to be not only meaningful, but in fact the very condition of meaning. A life without suffering is seen as frivolous and meaningless. This position must be rejected as a holdover from a now transcended stage of human history. The drive to make suffering meaningful may have had some functional logic in times when poverty, illness, and starvation were necessary features of existence. But we should reject this logic today and recognize that we have moved beyond the need to ground meaning in suffering. Work and the suffering that accompanies it should not be glorified. What is needed, therefore, is a counter-hegemonic approach to work, a project that would overturn existing ideas about the necessity and desirability of work, and the imposition of suffering as a basis for remuneration. The media is already changing the conditions of possibility, positioning UBI as not only a possible solution, but increasingly as a necessary solution to problems of technological unemployment. These hegemonic trends should be amplified. The dominance of work ethic also runs up against the changing material basis of the economy. Capitalism pretends that people work in order to make a living, yet it is increasingly unable to generate enough jobs. The tensions between the value accorded to the work ethic and these material changes will only heighten the potential for transformation of the system. Actions to make precarity and joblessness an increasingly visible political problem would go some way to generating the support for a post-work society. In the same way that Occupy raised awareness of inequality, the UK Uncut highlighted tax evasions. Perhaps most importantly, there's already a widespread hatred for jobs that can be tapped into. Much as neoliberal hegemony co-opted real desires and garnered active consent, so too must any post-work hegemony find its active force in the real desires of people. The widespread demand for others adopt the work ethic is only matched by the disdain we feel for our own jobs. Today, across the world, only 13% of people say they find their jobs engaging. Mentally drained, and socially exhausted, most workers find themselves under immense amounts of stress in their jobs. For the vast majority of people, work offers no meaning, fulfillment, or redemption. It is simply something to pay the bills. Those already excluded from jobs should not be fighting for inclusion in a society of work and labor, but rather be building the conditions to reproduce their lives outside of work. Changing the cultural consensus about the work ethic will mean taking actions at an everyday level, translating these medium-term goals into slogans, memes, and chants. It will require the undertaking of difficult and essential work of workplace organizing and campaigning, of mobilizing people's passions in order to topple the dominance of the work ethic. The success of these efforts will be clear when media discussions about automation shift from fear-mongering over lost jobs to celebrations of the freedom from drudgery. The realm of freedom. A 21st century left must seek to combat the centrality of work to contemporary life. In the end, our choice is between glorifying work and the working class or abolishing them both. The former position finds its expression in the folk political tendency to place value upon work, concrete labor and craft work. Yet the latter is the only true post-capitalist position. Work must be refused and reduced. building our synthetic freedom in the process. As we have set out in this chapter, achieving this will require the realization of 4 minimal demands. 1. Full automation. 2. The reduction of the working week. 3. The provision of a basic income. And 4. The diminishment of the work ethic. While each of these proposals can be taken as an individual goal in itself, their real power is expressed when they are advanced as an integrated program. This is not a simple marginal reform, but an entirely new hegemonic formation to compete against the neoliberal and social democratic options. The demand for full automation amplifies the possibility of reducing the workweek and heightens the need for a universal basic income. A reduction in the working week helps produce a sustainable economy and leverage class power. And a universal basic income amplifies potential to reduce the working week and expand class power. It would also accelerate the project of full automation as worker power rose and as the labor market tightened. The marginal cost of labor would increase as companies turned towards the machinery in order to expand. These goals resonate with each other, magnifying their combined power, and a new post-work hegemony would be resistant to reversion. Having created a mass constituency benefiting from its continuation, the ambition here is to take back the future from capitalism and build ourselves the 21st century world we want. It is to provide the time and money that are essential to any meaningful conception of freedom. The traditional battle cry of the left, demanding full employment, should therefore be replaced with a battle cry demanding full unemployment. But let us be clear, there is no technocratic solution, and there is no necessary progression into a post-work world. The struggles for full automation, a shorter working week, the end of the work ethic, and a universal basic income are primarily political struggles. The post-work imaginary generates a hyperstensional image of progress, one that aims to make the future an active historical force in the present. The struggles that such a project will face require that the left move past its folk political horizon, rebuild its power, and adopt an expansive strategy for change. It is to these issues that we now turn.